Welcome to the first episode of Chico First Town Hall. My hope is that by episode 20, we can all look back on this and laugh at how far we've come. I expected this to be a learning experience, and it was. I'm sorry for the poor production quality, but obviously I didn't know what I was doing, and well, I'll try to do much better next time. Also, I think it'd be much more interesting as a discussion between two or three panelists. As a result, this turned out to be more of a lecture. That was not the intent. Finally, picking a day and time was turned out to be tricky business. I learned that Thursday is also football night, and not being a fan, what do I know? Please comment as to what you think might be a better day or time for this event. Anyway, it is what it is. I did cover the intended material, and I've edited the video to remove those dead spots where I was waiting or during the two sessions. So thank you for your support. I look forward to seeing you for episode 2.
What we're going to talk about today is I just want to open the conversation about what happens when we're no longer burdened by the Warren settlement. And so I'm going to share the document that I posted on the newsletter. And these are the questions that I think we need to answer right here, which is, what is Chico required to do? What should we do, which is kind of the moral question? What can we do, which is a question of resources and so forth? And what should we stop doing? And so tonight, I'm going to really focus on the question of what is Chico required to do? And that's really sort of a legal question. So I want to move on to that. I'm going to say that I'm presuming that the people that we're talking about in the homeless population are indigent or incapacitated in one form or another. And indigence is a question of the means to take care of your needs. Incapacity and incompetence are conditions that trigger the welfare state. And so the question is, who has the responsibility? That's essentially what I'm going to try to address here. And so I'll start by saying that in our system, we have governments at different levels, organized at different levels. We have the federal government, which includes things like the HUD and for housing, and the Farm Bureau for like food stamps and things like that, other welfare programs. And then we have the state, which has been responsible for, things like the judicial system. And, I really don't need to go through that, but the state has other functions that are beyond the federal. And then the county is really considered to be an agent of the state. 85% of the county's budget comes from intergovernmental transfers. So most of the money that comes from the state funds programs that are state programs that are administered by county government. And then there's the cities, and Chico is a charter city. And my first question is, where do we fit in that hierarchy with regard to the homeless? So I'm going to refer to the one. Somebody have a question or no? I'm going to refer to the one relevant law here, which is the Welfare and Institutions Code. It's section 17,000, and I'm just showing you the paragraph right here. And I want to just go through what this means. This is essentially the assignment of duties for welfare of various forms. So there's two words here that I want to define. One of them is incompetent, and the other one is incapacitated. Incompetent has to do with mental capacity. Like, for example, the classic example is somebody that has, dementia. They don't have the mental ability to manage their own affairs. Incapacitated really refers to the physical limitations that somebody might have. And so for those categories of conditions where you're incompetent, poor, or indigent, meaning you don't have means, or incapacitated by age, disease, accident, or whatever, then such persons are need to be supported by the welfare functions of the state in the following order. And this sets up a section of priority. So if the person is not supported or relieved by their relatives or friends, or by their own resources, their own bank account, then it falls to the state. And in the last resort, it falls to the county. And so it says at the beginning, every county and every city county, which means San Francisco, which is the only city county in California. This is who is responsible for uh, care of the incompetent and incapacitated indigent people. Now, one of the questions is every homeless person indigent? It's an interesting question. Maybe we'll come back to that. But, when you show up in Chico as a homeless person and you get contacted by any of the homeless resources, one of the first things they do is they get you a Butte County ID, typically in the form of a driver's license or an ID card, because that's the first step and necessary to give you benefits, whatever they may be. And once you receive county benefits, are you still indigent or not? That's a question that we are not going to resolve today. But the main point that I want to make is that nowhere in this statute is city mentioned. In other words, a city does not have any duty to provide for indigent care, whether the person is incompetent or incapacitated, or what the reason that they're either incompetent or incapacitated might be. It never falls to the city to provide those services. So, what does that have to do with Warren? The question that came up under Warren is that when the Ninth Circuit passed or ruled on Martin v. Boise, that was an attempt by judicial decree to change this statute and make municipalities, cities, somehow responsible for providing welfare to the indigent or the homeless population. And prior to that decision, that decree never existed. The cities never had a role to play in the provision of welfare services. And then, as most of you know, the Ninth Circuit, the Martin Boise case was then good law back then, and that was the law that we were sued under in the Warren v. Chico case. And then we entered into a settlement agreement, which all of you know. And since that happened, since we were sued and since we entered into the settlement agreement, the Ninth Circuit ruled on a second case called the Grants Pass case that expanded the duties of cities under Martin. And that eventually went to the Supreme Court and was overturned, which means that all of the laws that we were sued under the Warren v. Chico case no longer are good law. The only reason that we're still stuck with the settlement is because the settlement is a contract. We entered into a contract and we're bound by it. It has nothing to do with the body of law or the welfare code. It has to do with the fact that we agreed to do certain things. And as you probably know, currently the city has two separate motions underway, one in district court and the other with the magistrate to try to get some relief. The motion, if it was successful, would mean that the city is only bound to follow the settlement agreement for the remaining 8 plaintiffs, 2 of which have died, 4 are in shelter, and 3 are missing. So it would essentially eliminate the Warren settlement from all practical purposes if we get a good ruling out of the court. But in the absence of any ruling from the court that changes the status quo, this Warren agreement will expire on January 14th of 2027. So a little less than 2 years from now. And the question is, what is the policy going to be for the city at that point? And I'm hoping that we can have a conversation about that topic before January of 2027, so that we're not approaching that date with, sort of flat feet and no plan and so forth. So I think I might want to stop there and see if anybody has any questions about that so far. What I'm really saying, and I guess what I'm asserting as a position, is that after Warren, the city of Chico really has no legal obligation to provide any welfare services, including funding shelters or doing anything else required by law. And I think that now would leave us to, well, what would they do? Well, they would use their police powers to enforce laws equally among all members of the population. So littering is littering, whether you're homeless or whether you're not homeless. Uh, Setting up a tent on public property is a code violation, whether you're homeless or whether you're not homeless. And I think that would be, in my view, that would be the focus. This is where the safety, cleanliness, beauty, and and vitality, economic vitality come into play. Those are really the primary responsibilities of the city of Chico with regard to its citizens. And it shouldn't change those obligations or duties, whether a person is homeless or not homeless or mentally disabled or addicted to drugs or a criminal or somebody with a long criminal history. The laws apply to everyone equally. And when we are free of the warrant, we should behave as a city equally to every citizen, and we should focus on conduct and not condition. Now that the Martin case. So the short answer to my first question here is, what is the city required to do? Legally, it's only required to provide for safety for its citizens, and that's part of its police power. So I want to stop right there and see if anybody, I'm looking at names here of people that are online. I doubt if there's anybody here that disagrees with that, but let me open it up and ask people if they have a comment or questions about that so far.
Rob, this is Terry Hernandez. I have a quick question.
Hi,
And
Terry.
hi, I might have dropped out. I dropped out for a second, so I might not have heard if you addressed this. But can you help me understand? You used littering as an example, and so I'll go with that.
Okay.
Why, if I litter, is that against the law and I would be punished? Rightly so. But why, if someone in the homeless population litters, the same is not done? I struggle with that. As one example of many pieces of this I struggle with.
So I want to be careful answering the question because I have very strong opinions about why that's true, but it should not be true. And the fact that we have behaved as if it is true, that we have one set of laws for homeless people and another set of laws for everybody else, has never been true. It should never have been accepted as a premise, but it was. Part of the reason that it was is because the Warren Settlement Agreement is a contract that the city attorney and the city manager at the time, Vince Ewing and Mark Orm, who are no longer here, negotiated. And in that agreement, they agreed to surrender certain police powers to the plaintiffs. Primarily, that means their attorney, LSNC. And so they said, well, before you can enforce or remove somebody from public property, you have to give them 17 days notice. Here's the procedure, et cetera, et cetera. And then, by the way, if I'm LSNC and I object, I can delay that even longer than 17 days, which has happened many times. So that's the reason that the city started doing it for things like encampments and, removing people from public land. But you ask about littering, and littering is not the same as camping. And we have other ordinances, like there's an ordinance against storing personal property on public land. That's illegal. And so when you go to any encampment, there's a tent, there's a bunch of stuff all around the tent, there's a bunch of garbage and all of that. All of that is either personal property or abandoned property. And it's illegal to store that on public land, and so it should be immediately removed. But we agreed in the settlement agreement to give them notice before we do that. Now, how does littering come into that? In the settlement agreement, there is a phrase that says you cannot enforce your anti-camping laws or any analogous law. And that has been interpreted by the city's attorneys as we can't do anything. We can't even enforce littering. We can't enforce public safety. The only thing that we can do is in what they call an exigent circumstance, like there's a gunfight or somebody's been assaulted or something like that, then the Warren settlement notice goes out the window. But otherwise, the attorneys have told the city that the settlement agreement applies to any enforcement action affecting a homeless person. In fact, if you go to the city ordinances right now and look up the anti-camping law, it'll say, well, a camp is anything like a tent, sleeping bags, and things like that. And it's prohibited in any place in the city unless it's specifically zoned for that. And of course, there are no camping locations that are zoned for camping in Chico. And so, but at the bottom of that ordinance, it says, this ordinance shall not be enforced against homeless persons. And to be honest with you, that's a direct violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. You cannot create separate laws or enforce laws based on the condition of people. Laws are to be enforced based on conduct, not condition. And so it has been a grave mistake on the part of the city to suspend enforcement of all laws using the Warren settlement as a basis for saying, well, we can't do it because the Warren settlement prevents us from that. So that's the answer. It's a mistake. Now, one of the things that has occurred recently is that the city attorney has been removed from the Warren case. And Scott Huber and his firm has, not the Scott Huber, the former council member, but attorney Scott Huber, is now running the Warren case, and he's the one that is bringing these motions before the federal court. So we're getting a completely different approach to the terms of the Warren settlement. But the short answer, I guess, is too late for that. But the short answer is that it's been a gross misunderstanding of what the city's obligation and rights are that have been surrendered under the Warren settlement, some of which has been completely illegal. In other words, there are some duties that the city has that they don't have the right to bargain away. For example, you cannot say to a third party, we will not enforce certain laws unless we ask you for permission. That would be a delegation of a non-delegable duty, and you can't do that. And that is one of the things that's being challenged in court right now, by the way, because this notice and all of this delay and all of that actually allows LS&C to be the final say as to whether or not Chico Police can enforce its own laws. And whether that changes before January 27th or not, it has never been correct, and it certainly won't be necessary after January of 27. Does that help, Terry?
Yeah, it did. Yeah, it's really difficult to be as rational as you are about this because, as I'm sure many people feel, it is so maddening to think that those folks that made that agreement put the entire city in the position that we are in today. It's
Well,
It's
here's another, I'm sorry, go ahead, Terry, I cut you off there.
no, I just said it's crazy.
So here's another story along those lines. You may recall that a couple of years ago, we floated an initiative that started off as the Quality of Life Act. And it was meant to embody these principles that are in the picture of this, this picture right here, the safety, cleanliness, beauty, and vitality, and this vision for Chico. And it actually did pass, but it got changed into a public nuisance ordinance. So what it ended up accomplishing was today, if you're a private citizen and on your land is some sort, like you got a junk car parked out on your curb for a month and whatever, that's considered to be a public nuisance. And so a citizen can file a complaint and code enforcement will come out and cite it, and eventually the cops will tow the truck away, I mean the car away. And that's a public nuisance. What this initiative did is it created a new ordinance that said a private citizen can also enforce public nuisance against the city where the nuisance is on city property. So think about the Eaton Cohasset campground. I don't think anybody would argue that that is a tremendous public nuisance. There's been dog attacks, there's been a killing out there, a gunfight, the trash, the rats, I mean, it's obviously it's a public nuisance. So one of the people that live near there, that has a business near there, used this ordinance to file a complaint with the city saying, this campground is having an impact on my quality of life, and we want you to come clean it up. And the city attorney said in response, we cannot do that because of the Warren settlement. So what has happened is the city has essentially suspended all of its quality of life laws, littering, public nuisance, camping in public places, distributing food from a non-commercial kitchen. All of these things have been illegal in Chico forever. But we just suspended all of that enforcement effort, pointing to the Warren Agreement, which we supposedly negotiated, as the reason why citizens are not entitled to the same laws that we have been entitled to forever. And it's a tragedy, and it has been wrong, and it's caused a lot of damage to the city. And I don't know what the ultimate reckoning is going to be, but it's not going to happen until we get through with the Warren settlement in one way or another. But it now sort of gets us to the policy question, which is the second question: what should we do? Because if we're not obligated by law to do anything other than enforce laws equally among people based on what their conduct is, then you have to shift to the moral argument that says, well, we may not have to do it, but we should do it because it's the compassionate thing to do, or it's the humanitarian thing to do. And the city should devote resources to providing welfare services, not because they have to, but because they should do it. And I think that's the battleground that we're going to face when it comes to establishing the policies that Chico is going to follow and impose when they're no longer burdened by the Warren settlement. What is the city going to do? For example, should the city continue to spend $5 million a year to provide for the pallet shelter? Is that an appropriate use of city resources? And if we say that that's not an appropriate use and we need to extract ourselves from that obligation, what will happen to the pallet shelter and who should pay for it and what should occur there? And these are the kind of questions that need to be discussed and faced. One of the reasons why I asked for this meeting, because we aren't talking about what our moral obligation is, because it's not just to the homeless population. That's 1,000 people roughly. There's 100,000, 103,000 people that live here. And so when we talk about our moral obligation to the citizens of Chico, we have to include the non-homeless, law-abiding, peaceful citizens, which are obviously numerically the vast majority. And we can't ask the entire population of Chico to sacrifice their quality of life because it's considered to be uncompassionate or unempathetic to not care for people who are clearly not caring for themselves. And they're also not caring for the community, obviously. I mean, the damage that they're creating is not accidental, it's a consequence of drug-addled, mentally challenged people living in an environment with no rules, no constraints, and no consequences. And the expectation that a tolerant citizenship should tolerate that in the interest of compassion. And I object to that whole line of reasoning. I think we have to put principles first and say, what is every citizen in this community entitled to? Well, one thing that they're entitled to is safety. We don't get to pick and choose who we provide safety to. Everybody is entitled to a safe environment. And so that means that we should be able to go to our public parks and not have to worry about whether or not it's safe, whether we're going to get infected by E. coli from Chico Creek, whether we're going to step on litter, whether we're going to encounter a dog that's off a leash, whether we're going to encounter a knucklehead that's been strung out on meth for a week and now they're hallucinating and paranoid and violent. We don't get to pick and choose who we provide safety to. And so I would argue that the real compassionate thing is to restore dignity to the people that are obviously struggling in life in conforming to basic social standards, which means that you do not have a right to impose your will and your habits and your lifestyle and your destruction on innocent citizens around you. And that would be the moral position that I would take, that the city has to say the principle is everyone is entitled to safety, no exceptions. And so anybody, no matter what their condition might be, whether they're just intoxicated or whether they're, a meth addict that has completely addled their brain and they're operating on another entire plane of, consciousness, it doesn't matter. If what they're doing is creating a safety hazard for someone else, it needs to be stopped. And that is the first step. You stop it. You don't investigate a crime before you stop it from occurring. When cops drive up on a gunfight, they don't start investigating who started it. They stop the gunfight. That's the first principle of safety. And so the question is, why wouldn't that apply to every single individual in this community, whether you're homeless or not homeless? That's my position. I don't know if anybody wants to disagree with that or challenge it or ask a question about it, please do.
Hey, Rob Barry, it's Julie Threet.
Hi,
How are you?
I'm good.
First of all, thank you for having this. I think this is a great idea. It's a good experiment. I would love to see it maybe kind of continue on and maybe, without football and baseball on. But so, I spent a lot of time at the county, right? And I do think this is a county responsibility. I mean, they just, extended the shelter declaration and they use that because they're getting a lot of grant funds,
Yeah.
millions of dollars. And they passed Measure H, right? This 1% sales tax. So I think it's on the county, but do you know what the city of Oroville, are they paying for their pallet shelter at that rescue mission? Or are they getting county funds for that? Do you
I
know?
don't know. I don't follow Orville's
Yeah.
ins and outs. I know that they have a shelter. I know that they have declared a shelter crisis. I think that if I'm not mistaken, I think that one is built with federal money on private land. So it's not the same as our pallet shelter here where it's public money on city land. So there's some differences there. But I think everybody has labored under the assumptions that we've been fed essentially under Warren. And of course, as you all probably remember, I certainly remember very clearly, the process of negotiating the settlement agreement was done entirely in secret. No one ever had a chance to question or challenge any of the assumptions that the powers that existed at that time were building into this settlement agreement. And I think the citizens of Chico have been very patient about, well, maybe it'll work out, maybe something will happen. But if you look at where we are today, and you just go down to City Hall and take a look at what's around City Hall, it's not that much different than it was in 2021 before we were sued by Warren. So it has not produced the results that even it promised to produce. So we have to get back to, common sense. And the question that I want to pose to the group here is, do we have the moral courage to do the right thing and insist that the right policies get established? Or are we going to be intimidated by the accusation that failure to step in and fill the gaps that are left by the county and the state falls on the city? Now, this is something that Mark Warren, the former city manager, once said to a direct question in a city council meeting. He said, isn't this, he was asked by one of the council members, I think it might have been Casey, isn't the county and the state have responsibility for this? Like, why are we doing it? And his response is, well, when the county and the state fail to do their duty, it's up to the city to step in and fill in the gap. And I disagree with that. I think when you step in and fill in the gap, it provides air cover for the county and the state to continue to fail to do their duty and to continue to encourage cities to take on the burden of providing welfare services that should properly be prepared or provided by the state through the county. Between the state and the county, that's where the duty lies. Now, there are some things that make sense for the state. Like, for example, state prisons are an example that should exist at the state. But the state also passed Prop 47, which filled up our county jails, which is one of the reasons why cops cannot enforce misdemeanors because there's no place to put them. You can't send them to jail for a night because there's no room at the inn. And so it's a systemic problem that we can't solve as a city, but we have to understand we have to have moral clarity about what our obligations are and what is the right thing to do for the general welfare of the citizens of Chico. And we need to be able to stand by those principles. And there's no doubt that people will suffer if the city fails to provide the services and the state also fails to provide the services. People are going to suffer. But the sad truth is, people are suffering right now. We have people dying almost every week, if not every month, from overdoses, from chronic health issues, living on the street, untreated infections, et cetera, et cetera. I think I've probably quoted this a number of times. The meeting is gonna shut off here quickly. So if it does, just log back on, and I'll be there for a new session. But um, I sort of forgot what I was going to say.
Well, I definitely think we need to have the moral courage that as of January 1, that Eaton and Cohasset shelter gets torn down, it gets taken away. That was an extra obligation that I think nobody wants, and it's failed, and it's clearly caused and then that's kind of our first litmus test, right? Are we, that needs to just go away. And then now these other shelter programs, I feel like they're kind of working where, if people start to pile up in Depot Park or in Humboldt Park, then there's this process where they get ticketed and they get told, go to one of these other shelters we've got. There's three of them or four of them or whatever it is. But this is Scott Kennelly's responsibility, in my opinion. And I think it's fully on the county to then, I
Well,
think we should,
Scott is,
yeah.
so I've talked with Scott. I invited him
Okay.
to this meeting, but it was not possible for him to be here. But as he pointed out correctly, behavioral health is one department in the county. And there are other departments. For example, there's public health and there's, employment and social services. And all of those different departments are responsible for providing different elements of the welfare services. So it's not 100% up to Scott. But the fact of the matter is, Scott's kind of in the same boat we are in the sense that the state mandates that the county provide certain services because of this welfare code that I've been quoting. Whatever the state does not provide, the county is required to provide. And the state mandates those services, but they also fund them. And so if they don't provide funding at the state level, even though, let's say Scott wanted to take in every mentally disabled or addicted person in Chico, they don't have the beds, the rehab center, the capacity to actually do that. But the hard lesson here is that may well be true. In fact, it is true. But that doesn't mean that the duty then falls to the city to spend its money on things that they're not prepared or equipped to deal with. We don't have a drug rehab system in the city, nor should we have one. And so either the county provides the services or they don't get provided. And not providing them is part of the moral commitment here that we have to have the courage to defend, which is just because somebody else doesn't do their duty doesn't mean that I have to now uh, rush in and fill the gap. We have to establish the rules that we're willing to live by based on fair and equitable principles and the law. And we need to stop doing those things that we don't have a role in, which I guess brings us to the next question, which is what can we do? And in theory, we can do a lot. Like, for example, we can defund the police and take that money and build homeless shelters. And we can continue to shelter people as they come to Chico. And, we currently have several sources of unutilized shelter capacity. And so when you go out to Eaton and Cohasset and you talk to the people, why aren't you there? There are, out of the 11 people that are qualified to be there, 6 of them are qualified to move into the pallet shelter. Why aren't they? And how can we force them? We let them stay on the street instead of, and part of the reason is because state law does not give us the means to force somebody into shelter. But it does give us the right to remove people from our streets. And that's what we have to do because that's the only power that we actually have is to enforce local quality of life laws. And that's what we need to focus on. So I think we need to withdraw from the funding of direct services wherever those are occurring. The Warren settlement is by far the biggest one. That'll cost the city $25 million before we're finished just for the pallet shelter. That doesn't count the alternative site. It doesn't count public works, cleaning up sites. I mean, it doesn't count the legal fees that we've spent trying to maneuver and navigate through. Who's raising their hand? Somebody? Don't know. Okay, so I guess I want to move to the next question, which is what can we do? What can we do is a function of capacity and resources. We have a limited budget with limited resources, and there are many things that the city is required to do that nobody else but the city can do. No one else can hire a police department for the city of Chico but the city of Chico. Now, we could outsource our fire department and contract with CAL FIRE or some other deal, but we still have to pay for the fire service. We're still obligated. And you can't blame people for not being as deep into the details as I am about this, but it is important that we come to some sort of a understanding in our town about what we want our city government to do. and what we can do outside of city government. I don't think everything that can be done doesn't necessarily have to be done by city government. But I think it's unrealistic to expect elected officials to know what to do without the community having a clear sense of what they want. And I think when it comes to the homeless issue, it is one of the most misunderstood and least discussed topics in Chico. And I've been working on it now for 9 years, and it's amazing how little people understand about the details and the history of the Warren, and it goes beyond, before Warren. I mean, there were many things were going on besides Warren. But I want to because I am recording this, I'm going to try to put together a summary tape and publish that. I want to try to go through these 4 questions real quick. So we've talked about what the city's required to do. We've talked about what they should do, the moral question. The what can we do is really a question of resources and capacity. On the capacity side, we don't really have uh, the ability to provide welfare services. Now, because of the Warren case, we did hire basically some outreach, sort of social work functions, because that's part of what is required under the Warren settlement. But that's a first. We've never done that before, and we shouldn't be doing it because you can't put your toe into the welfare services. You either have to be in or you have to be out. So the one of the reasons why the laws direct state and counties is because states and counties are funded in a way to hire people that are credentialed, that have expertise to actually know how to assess and provide services and help people. The city has no such staff and no such capacity. We have a police department, we have a fire department, we have a public works department, and we have a parks department. And basically that's our entire budget. And so that's number one, I suppose. Number two is that among other things that have happened in the history of state politics in California is that the revenue of a local community is increasingly being transferred through taxes and fees to either county or primarily state government. And it means that the city now has fewer resources to do those things that only it can do. And most of our road repair, for example, happens because we get a grant. And those grants are merely the money that we send to Sacramento that comes back to us, 10 cents on the dollar in the form of a grant that tells us where we can build, what we can build, how we need to build it, rather than the traditional model is that a charter city is responsible for managing its own municipal affairs. And in the past, cities used tax and fees and other things to finance their own operations. And not so much of the local economy was transferred to state and county through taxes. So we actually have less of a limitation or less of a capacity to fund anything other than those essential services because we're already having difficulty funding the essential services. The headcount in our police department is just one of many examples. The condition of our roads is another great example. If we ever eliminate encampments out of our parks, I think there's probably 10 years of environmental rehabilitation that needs to take place in our parks. Every time I walk in Bidwell Park, especially lower Bidwell Park, it saddens me to realize just how damaged things are and how long it would take for the environment to sort of be restored to its, natural pristine state, which is what we all want. So I think there's a lot of uh, reasons why we should sort of pull in our horns and really focus on those things that we can do and that only the city can do and that nobody else is going to do for us. which leads me now to the last question, which is what should we stop doing? We should stop doing anything that doesn't fall in that category of the things that only the city can do for its citizens. So, for example, we should stop running the pallet shelter. Now, whether that happens abruptly, like we just pull the plug, or whether it transitions over time, or how that gets managed is a completely different question. But in the end result should be that the city is devoting whatever resources it has to providing for quality of life and improving quality of life through making sure that we have safety, making sure that our environment is clean and pristine and healthy, making sure that we have the opportunity to beautify our city in various ways, and to make sure that we're focusing on the economic vitality of our community by attracting businesses, making sure people have a place to live, and so forth and so on. We have to have businesses to have employees. We have to have employees to have workers. We need housing for workers, et cetera. And so economic vitality is sort of an all-encompassing topic, but only the city can focus on its own economic vitality. So in my view, those are the things that we should focus on doing. And then I guess the last question here before we wrap it up is, what should we stop doing? We should stop doing anything that is not directly contributing to the improved quality of life in Chico. And so that means that we should stop spending money on things that really are the responsibility of other areas. But it also means that we should do those things that we do for other industries. Now, one of my greatest complaints, and unfortunately, there's no representatives of the homeless industry here because I give them a lot of static, and it's not personal. It's just talking about the operation of the homeless industry as an industry in this city. It's one of the only industries, it is the only industry, as far as I can tell, that is not regulated by the city. The only time the city gets involved in regulating the homeless industry is when it is issuing a use permit to the Jesus Center or to the tourist shelter or to the pallet shelter. And but it doesn't regulate the performance of those organizations in terms of outcomes. So, for example, right now, in the city of Chico, there are a large number of different entities that all provide shelter beds. Some of them serve victims of domestic violence. Some of them serve transitional housing like CHAT. Some of them serve emergency shelter, congregate shelter like the tourist shelter. Some of them provide non-congregate shelter like the Jesus Center. But in all of those entities that are providing some services to the homeless population, there is a survey that's required by HUD to be done every year, and it's called the Housing Inventory Count. And every entity that receives government money must report on how many beds they have, how many beds, what kind are they? Are they seasonal? Are they low barrier? Are they, whatever? And what the occupancy rate of those beds are. So, for example, we know publicly that the pallet shelter has 177 units. They're housing about 210 or 20 people, somewhere in there. And there are somewhere between 10 and 30 empty pallet shelters at any given time. We know that the tourist shelter has empty beds almost every day. They almost have always had space that is not being utilized. Well, it used to be that the continuum of care would conduct these housing inventory count because it's part of their obligation under their HUD grant, and they would publish a spreadsheet. In fact, when we were intervening in the Warren case, we got the raw data and we looked at all of the entities that were providing beds, and sometimes the occupancy rate was 60%. the Esplanade House as an example. Like they had 30% vacancy, and a number of them are that way. Well, what happened? COC started refusing to give us the raw data. And now they only give us aggregate data that says this is the total number of low barrier beds that exist in Chico without any indication of where those beds are coming from. And they do not provide any information about occupancy rate. So if the city was trying to decide whether to issue a new permit for a new shelter, one of the sources of data that they should look at is, well, how many shelter beds do we have and how many of them are unused? And if there's a lot of unused beds, then why should we build more shelters? But that data is not available to the city or to the public. And so one of the things that I think the city should be involved in is regulating the homeless industry. It's a $200 or $300 million industry in this county. And for that, you have to count Section 8 and subsidized housing and food stamps and all the other Social Security and all the other things that pay people salary to provide services. But the way those services are evaluated is they're evaluated on the number of services provided. There is no measurement of the outcomes of those services. So are we moving people from the street to shelter to permanent housing to job and being able to work and be self-sustaining, or are we permanently warehousing people in government subsidized housing? We should know the answer to that. And so one of the things that I recommend is that one of the things that the city needs to start doing is they need to start conditioning the operation of homeless services in this city based on some regulatory scheme that says that there's a certain amount of reporting that you have to provide to the city so that the city understands, number one, what is the nature of your operation and how effective is it at producing the outcome that you receive grant money, our tax money, to provide. And that element, that the accountability on outcome, is a completely missing element in the entire homeless industry. In fact, some of you may have heard about the state auditor's report on the $24 billion that the state has invested in the homeless industry, and they can't figure out where half of that money went. Nobody even knows what it was spent on, much less any measurement or accountability for the outcomes produced as a result of that investment. And so we can't really control the state, but we could control what happens within the jurisdiction of the city of Chico. And we could require, for example, a use permit for every homeless service that's operated within the city. And in exchange for that permit, we could require a certain level of reporting that looked at outcomes. And where we find that the state is failing to provide the legal means to, for example, require people to participate in services in exchange for shelter, then we should lobby the state through our organizations, the League of Cities and other organizations, for the state to make changes to their laws to allow us to do a better job of moving people off the street and into services that actually make a difference in their life. I think the biggest one right now that is being talked about is drug rehab. So there's been some laws that have been passed that allow people to be conserved if they're addicted to drugs. But the problem is we don't have facilities. I think the Jesus Center right now is applying for a state grant to open 16 rehab beds on their property over on Fair Street. This is a long-term project, but essentially it is a project to provide treatment beds so that people like behavioral health can actually provide addiction rehab services that are obviously needed in the county, but we don't really have the beds. And we don't have the beds because the state has not provided the funding for the county to build those facilities and those beds. And, the jails are another thing. We're adding 100 beds to the jail. Some of those beds are psych beds. where if you're arrested and you're addicted to drugs, the county jail is required to provide you rehab. But the problem is, where do you put those people while they're in rehab? Well, the jail expansion will provide some of those beds, but uh, in behavioral health, oftentimes has to send people out of county in order to get them in a rehab bed so that they can be provided drug rehab. So my point is that this is an ecosystem. The ecosystem is sick. It's got it broken in a number of places, but it is not up to the city to try to rush in and patch up those failures of the county and the state for providing services that they're obligated to provide. And I think that is the main corner that I'm interested in turning in the city in terms of a policy position. And that is the city government needs to be very clear about what its legal and moral obligations are with regard to its citizenry, whether homeless or not homeless. And they need to establish the principles from which they're going to operate in the future. And they need to transition into a city that functions along those principles instead of the principles that we've been led to believe we're somehow obligated to follow. And that's the Martin v. Boise case, the Grants Pass case, which are no longer good law, and the settlement agreement, which soon, hopefully sooner than later, will also no longer be a governing document for the city and will be free to establish policy that makes sense for the citizens. And we have to get from where we are today to that point where we're actually functioning as a city operating within its charter duties and not expanding and diluting our resources, doing things that are beyond either our legal or moral obligation. So that's the end of my speech. Feedback, please, if there is any.
Thank you, Rob. This was very informative. This is Gina Bax. Yeah, it's great. Hopefully we can do it more often.
So I guess the thing that I would ask is that I'm going to edit these two tapes together, which is basically mostly me talking, unfortunately. But I'm going to edit them together. I'm going to post them on the Chico First webpage so that people can find it and at least listen to this presentation, let's call it. And hopefully we can increase the attendance. Maybe we can get some panelists here. I was hoping to do that today, but it just didn't work out. But I would love to encourage people like, well, Addison Winslow, for example, to come on and debate whether or not what I said is true or whether he has a different point of view, so that we can have a legitimate civil discourse over the future of Chico. And if he feels strongly about some position, I'm picking on him. I think it's true of anybody. If they have a strong position, they should be willing to come on and defend it in public and answer questions and be challenged. And I fully welcome people to challenge me on my point of view. But the difference I think that I'm trying to establish here is that I don't think there can be anybody that tries very hard that would be very confused about what I believe. I've done everything I know how to do. I've written about it. I'm talking about it. I'm having this call. This is what I believe to be true. And if there's anybody in this city that thinks that what I'm saying is incorrect, then I welcome them to engage in a conversation so that we can sort this out. Because I can't see any way to proceed post Warren unless we have some clarity about our legal and moral obligations as a city. What does it mean to be a charter city? What are the municipal affairs that we are duty bound to fulfill? And what are the things that are beyond our jurisdiction, beyond our scope of responsibility that we should not do, even though they desperately need to be done? But you can't do everybody's job. You have to let people, do or not do their own job and hold them accountable for that. But I think this is the situation that the city's faced with. So maybe going forward, you can help promote this idea. If we can get enough people interested, we'll rent a room and we'll do this live. Maybe we can get the production quality up and get it off of Zoom and do something a little bit more sophisticated. But I would like to pursue this format, let's call it, of sort of open discussion and debate. So with that, I want to thank you all for spending your time listening to me rant on. Appreciate it. Any last words from anyone? Okay, thank you
Thank you,
very much
Rob.
for, sorry?
Thank you, Rob.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. Okay, talk to you soon.
Bye, Rob. Thank you.
Bye-bye.